She was barely 8 years old, her shoulder-length dark hair a tangled mess, her face streaked with the salt of dried tears as she stood trembling in the center of the city's most dangerous office. She didn't have a weapon, and she didn't have an appointment, all she had was a piece of paper labeled "Bad Man." Outside that door, 40 armed men would have died for a glance from the man behind the desk. But inside, the air went cold as Lee Hyun-woo, the most feared syndicate leader in Seoul, stared at the drawing in his hands. His knuckles turned white, his eyes locking onto the ruby ring drawn in red wax. It was the same ring that had been burned into his nightmares since the night his own father was murdered. When his elite security finally burst in to drag her out, Hyun-woo didn't raise his voice. He simply raised a hand, and the room went deathly silent. Because in the underworld, you don't just stumble into Hyun-woo's sanctum and survive, unless you're carrying the one secret that could burn the entire city to the ground. If you felt a chill down your spine when you saw the look in that little girl's eyes, go ahead and hit that subscribe button. Stories about the innocent finding a voice in the dark need to be told. Don't let Hae-rin's story go unheard like everyone else in Seoul did. Drop a comment and tell me, what would you do if a child handed you the key to your worst enemy? Stick around, because what Hyun-woo does next will change everything. Lee Hyun-woo didn't reach for his gun. He didn't have to. After a decade spent turning a fractured street gang into a multi-billion-won empire, he had learned that the loudest person in the room is usually the weakest. He was a man of calculated urgency, a shark in a tailored black suit who saw the world in assets and liabilities. He looked at Hae-rin, at her worn-out sneakers and the way she tried to hide her shaking hands behind her back. To anyone else, she was a stray. To the men hunting her, she was a loose end. But to Hyun-woo, looking at that drawing was like looking into a mirror of his own shattered past. The bad man in the crayon strokes wasn't just a villain in a child's story. It was Park Sang-dae, the man the underworld called the Butcher, and the only man Hyun-woo had ever truly feared. The girl took a shaky step forward, her voice a mere whisper in the vast, silent room. "He's coming for me," she said. "Because I saw where he keeps the ledger." In that moment, the King of Shadows felt something he hadn't felt in 20 years, a pulse. Hyun-woo stared at the drawing until the red crayon marks of the ring seemed to bleed into the paper. It wasn't just a child's doodle, it was a signature written in the blood of his lineage. For 15 years, he had searched for that specific ruby setting, a grotesque, gold-clawed band worn by the man who had executed his father in a rain-slicked shipyard. To see it now, rendered by the trembling hand of an 8-year-old girl, felt like a thunderclap in the silent office. "Where did you see this man, Hae-rin?" Hyun-woo asked. His voice was no longer the sharp blade he used for business, it was a low, grounded rumble, designed to keep the girl from shattering. Hae-rin's lip quivered. She pointed a small, dirty finger at the drawing. "At the big house with the iron gates. He was talking to my stepfather. They were counting heavy black bags and laughing about the orphans. He saw me in the hallway, he told me if I told anyone, he'd make me disappear like my mother." The air in the room seemed to drop 10 degrees. Behind Hyun-woo, his lead enforcer, Min-ho, shifted uncomfortably. They all knew the house with the iron gates. It belonged to Park Sang-dae, the Butcher of the Iron Lotus. For years, there had been a fragile ceasefire between Hyun-woo's syndicate and Sang-dae's faction, a cold peace built on mutual distance. But if Sang-dae was moving the black bags and threatening children, the peace wasn't just cold, it was dead. Hyun-woo stood up, his tall frame casting a long, intimidating shadow over the mahogany desk. He tucked the drawing into the inner pocket of his suit, right against his heart. "Min-ho," he said, not looking back. "Seal the building. No one enters, no one leaves. If a single word of this girl's presence reaches the street, I'll consider it a personal betrayal." He walked around the desk and knelt in front of Hae-rin. It was a gesture of vulnerability that his men had never witnessed. He reached out, his manicured hand hovering for a second before gently brushing a stray, matted lock of hair from her eyes. "You did a brave thing coming here," he whispered. "The man in this drawing, he is a ghost from my past, too. But ghosts can't hurt you when they're buried. Do you understand?" Hae-rin nodded slowly, a single tear escaping and carving a clean path through the grime on her cheek. Are you a bad man, too? She asked, her voice small and piercingly honest. Hyunwoo paused, the weight of 1,000 sins pressing against his shoulders. He looked at the high-end security monitors, the cold marble floors, and the life of violence he had meticulously built. I have been, he admitted. But for you, I'm going to be the monster that hunts the one you're afraid of. He stood up and turned to his consoles, his eyes igniting with a predatory focus. The hunt hadn't just begun, a war was being declared. He began typing commands, activating sleeper cells and surveillance grids across Seoul. Park Sang-dae thought he was untouchable behind his gates and his political friends, but he had made one fatal mistake. He had left a witness alive, and that witness had found the only man in Korea who wasn't afraid to burn the world down to protect her. Prepare the cars, Hyunwoo commanded, his voice turning back to stone. We're going to the shipyard. It's time the butcher learned that some drawings never fade. The black sedan glided through the rain-slicked streets of Seoul, a silent ghost cutting through the neon haze of Gangnam. Inside, the only sound was the rhythmic hum of the engine and Haerin's shallow, uneven breathing. She sat huddled in the corner of the leather seat, clutching the backpack Hyunwoo's men had retrieved from her school locker. Hyunwoo watched her from the shadows of the back seat, his mind already 3 moves ahead, calculating the logistics of a war he hadn't planned to fight. They arrived at a blind apartment, a high-tech loft hidden behind the facade of an aging textile warehouse. As the heavy steel door hissed shut, Haerin finally relaxed her shoulders, the sterile blue light of the room reflecting in her wide eyes. Hyunwoo sat opposite her, placing the bad man drawing on a glass table between them. You told me you saw them counting bags, Haerin, he said, his voice a calm anchor in the quiet room. But there's more to this drawing, isn't there? Your father, he was an architect for the city council before he went missing. He taught you how to look at things differently. Haerin reached into her bag and pulled out a small, dried lemon. With the practiced movements of a child playing a secret game, she asked for a bowl and a lamp. Hyunwoo watched in grim fascination as she squeezed the juice onto the back of the drawing and held the paper close to the warm bulb of a desk lamp. Slowly, the crude crayon strokes of the bad man were joined by a faint, amber lattice of lines. What had looked like a child's background, simple trees and jagged mountains, began to transform. The trees were actually a series of coordinates, the mountains were the structural silhouettes of the new redevelopment zone in the Han River district. It wasn't just a drawing. It was a topographical overlay of the city's most protected infrastructure. Papa told me to draw the bad man over the map, Haerin whispered, her voice trembling. He said the colors would hide the truth from anyone who didn't know how to look. He told me the red ring isn't just a ring. It's where the money is buried. Hyunwoo leaned in, his pulse quickening. He recognized the symbols now. They weren't just locations, they were the offshore routing numbers and physical vault locations for the Council of Seven. Sang-dae wasn't just running a protection racket, he was the treasurer for a political coup. The simple drawing in front of him was the death warrant for the most powerful men in the country. He looked at Haerin, seeing the immense burden her father had placed on her small shoulders. She wasn't just a witness to a murder, she was a walking vault key. The weight of the discovery settled heavily in the room. If Sang-dae found out what this paper truly held, he wouldn't just kill her, he would erase every trace that she ever existed. Haerin, Hyunwoo said, his expression softening into a look of fierce, protective resolve. Your father gave you a map to justice. But in this city, justice is a fire that burns everyone it touches. He stood up, turning to the window where the Seoul skyline glittered like a pile of cold jewels. He knew now that his empire was no longer enough to keep her safe. To save this girl, he would have to do the one thing he had avoided for a lifetime, he would have to tear down the very system that had made him a king. The map was clear, and for the first time in 15 years, Hyunwoo knew exactly where to strike. The calm of the high-rise sanctuary shattered with the sudden, sharp crack of a sniper's round. The reinforced glass of the loft didn't disintegrate, instead, it spiderwebbed into 1,000 glittering shards that caught the blue light like falling diamonds. Hyunwoo didn't hesitate. Before the sound of the second shot could echo against the warehouse walls, he had lunged across the table, sweeping Haerin off her feet and shielding her small body with his own. Close your eyes, he commanded, his voice a low roar over the sudden cacophony of breaking glass and distant sirens. He didn't wait for his security team to respond. He knew the efficiency of the Iron Lotus. If they had found this hideout, the perimeter was already compromised. He felt Heirin's small hands fist into the lapels of his suit, her breath coming in jagged, terrified gasps against his neck. He moved with a brutal, predatory grace, staying low as he navigated the debris-strewn floor. Another volley of gunfire erupted, this time from the hallway. The heavy steel door groaned under the force of a breaching charge. Hyunwoo reached the hidden service elevator just as the primary entrance exploded inward in a cloud of dust and fire. He didn't look back to see the men in tactical gear swarming his sanctuary. His focus was entirely on the weight in his arms, the fragile life that had become the center of his world. As the elevator descended, the silence inside the small metal box was deafening. Heirin was shaking so violently that her teeth chattered, her messy dark hair matted with plaster dust. Hyunwoo felt a warm stickiness on his shoulder and realized a shard of glass had sliced through his jacket, but he didn't feel the sting. He only felt a cold, simmering rage that he hadn't known he was still capable of. Sangdae hadn't just attacked a rival, he had hunted a child in Hyunwoo's care. The doors opened into the dim, oil-scented bowels of the parking garage. Minho was already there, the engine of a nondescript armored SUV idling like a growling beast. "They're closing off the district, boss," Minho reported, his hand resting on the grip of his sidearm. "Sangdae's put a price on the girl's head that has every street dog in Seoul salivating." Hyunwoo slid into the back seat, never letting go of Heirin. He tucked her into the footwell, covering her with his heavy overcoat. "Let them come," he said, his eyes turning into twin chips of flint. "Sangdae thinks he's cleaning up a mess. He doesn't realize he's just started the fire that's going to consume him." As the SUV surged forward, tires screeching against the concrete, Hyunwoo looked down at the crumpled drawing still clutched in Heirin's hand. The bad man was no longer just a target on a map. He was a dead man walking. The first strike had landed, but as they sped into the neon-lit chaos of the city, Hyunwoo knew the counterattack would be legendary. He leaned back, his hand resting protectively on the girl's head, finally understanding that he wasn't just fighting for a map or a memory anymore. He was fighting for the only thing that made him feel human. The armored SUV sped through the rain-drenched periphery of the city, the neon lights of Seoul fading into a rhythmic blur of blue and amber. In the shadowed back seat, the adrenaline of the escape had curdled into a heavy, hollow exhaustion. Heirin was still tucked under Hyunwoo's overcoat, her small body trembling with a force that no heater could soothe. Hyunwoo looked down at his hands. They were steady, as always, but he could feel the ghost of his own childhood rising in the dark. He reached out and gently squeezed Heirin's shoulder. "I grew up in a place like the one you're afraid of," he said, his voice barely louder than the hum of the tires. Heirin looked up, her eyes wide and searching. "You had a drawing too?" "No," Hyunwoo replied, a bittersweet smile ghosting his lips. "I had a watch. A silver one my father gave me before he told me to hide in the shipping crates. He told me to count the seconds until the shouting stopped. I counted to 3,000 before I realized he wasn't coming back." He leaned his head back against the leather headrest, the memory of the shipyard, the smell of salt and rust, flooding his senses. "I spent a long time being angry at that watch. I thought that because I survived and he didn't, I had to become something hard. Something made of iron. I thought that if I never cared about anyone again, I could never be hurt again." Heirin shifted, pulling the coat tighter around her chin. "Is that why you look so sad when you think no one is watching?" The question pierced through his armor more effectively than any bullet. He looked at her, this small, fragile girl who had seen the worst of humanity and still had the clarity to see him. "Perhaps," he admitted. "But seeing you walk into my office, it reminded me of the boy who hid in those crates. For 15 years, I've been building walls to keep the world out. But you reminded me that some walls are just cages." He reached into his pocket and pulled out the crumpled "Bad Man" drawing. He smoothed it over his knee with a tenderness that would have shocked his enemies. "Your father didn't just give you a map to a treasure, Heirin. He gave you a map to a choice. He knew that the only way to stop men like Sangdae isn't to be more violent than them, but to be more honest. Heirin reached out a tentative hand, resting her tiny palm over his scarred knuckles. The silence in the car changed then. It was no longer the silence of two strangers fleeing a predator, but the quiet understanding of two survivors finding home in the middle of a storm. "I'm scared," she whispered. "I know," Hyunwoo said, his voice gaining a new, ironclad conviction. "But for the first time in 15 years, I'm not. I'm going to finish the story my father started, and I'm going to make sure yours has a better ending. You aren't alone in the crates anymore, Heirin. I'm right here." As the car banked into a sharp turn toward the coast, Heirin finally let her head rest against his arm. The King of Shadows sat in the dark, watching over a sleeping child, realizing that his empire was a small price to pay for the chance to finally stop counting the seconds and start living them. Hyunwoo turned to see Minho standing in the doorway. Minho had been with him since the early days of the syndicate, a man who had bled for Hyunwoo more times than either could count. He was the only person Hyunwoo trusted to guard his back while he slept. "The girl's drawing is secure?" Minho asked, his eyes flicking toward the paper resting on the table next to Heirin. "It's more than a drawing, Minho," Hyunwoo replied, his voice low. "It's the end of the Council of Seven. Once we verify the routing numbers through our contacts in Switzerland, Sangdae and his political puppets will have nowhere left to hide." Minho nodded slowly, stepping into the room. He walked toward the table, his movements fluid and practiced. "It's a lot of weight for one man to carry. Especially for a girl who isn't even yours." Hyunwoo sensed the shift in the air before he saw the movement. It was a subtle change in the atmosphere, the way the temperature seems to drop right before a storm breaks. He saw Minho's hand drift toward the small of his back, not with the casual readiness of a guard, but with the lethal intent of an executioner. "Sangdae offered me a seat, Hyunwoo," Minho said, his voice devoid of its usual warmth. "A real seat. Not just a place at a table of ghosts and shadows. The council is tired of your immorals. They want stability. They want the map." Before the sentence was finished, Minho's gun was drawn. Hyunwoo didn't reach for his own weapon, he moved for Heirin. He lunged across the space, his shoulder slamming into her chair to knock her toward the safety of the heavy oak desk just as the first bullet tore through the air where her head had been a second before. The glass window behind them exploded, the sea breeze rushing in like a cold gasp. "Go. Under the desk." Hyunwoo roared, his hand finally finding the pistol tucked into his waistband. The room became a blur of muzzle flashes and splintering wood. Minho was good, he was the best Hyunwoo had trained, but he was fighting a man who had just found something worth living for. Hyunwoo fired 3 shots in rapid succession, forcing Minho to dive behind a stone pillar. "You're throwing away 20 years for a child, Hyunwoo," Minho shouted over the gunfire. "Sangdae is already on his way. You can't win this." Hyunwoo didn't answer. He looked at Heirin, who was curled into a ball under the desk, her hands over her ears. The betrayal burned a hot, jagged blade in his chest, but as he heard the distant thrum of approaching helicopters, the hurt vanished, replaced by a cold, crystalline clarity. The Judas kiss had been delivered, and the sanctuary was now a cage. He reached out, grabbing the drawing from the table even as bullets shredded the wood around it. He had lost his brother, but he would not lose the girl. "Hold on to me," he whispered as he grabbed Heirin and prepared to leap into the dark, churning water below. The war had officially moved from the shadows into the light. The descent into the churning sea had been a desperate gamble, but the escape across the city was a grueling test of endurance. By the time they reached the rooftops of the old industrial sector, the rain had turned into a punishing deluge, slicking the corrugated metal and ancient tile into a treacherous labyrinth. Hyunwoo moved with a heavy, uneven limp, a souvenir from a bullet that had grazed his thigh during the villa breakout, but his grip on Heirin remained unbreakable. Behind them, the rhythmic beat of a helicopter's rotors drew closer, the beam of a high-powered searchlight cutting through the downpour like a predatory eye. Sangdae's men were no longer hiding, they were hunting with the frantic energy of those who knew that a bad man drawing was the only thing standing between them and a prison cell. We're almost there, Haerin, Hyunwoo grunted, his breath hitching as they reached a narrow gap between two six-story buildings. Below, the alley was a black chasm, 50 feet of empty air ending in concrete. To anyone else, it was a dead end. To Hyunwoo, it was the only way to the service tunnels. But as he prepared to leap, his wounded leg buckled. The slick metal edge of the roof gave way under his weight, and for a terrifying heartbeat, the world tilted. Hyunwoo's fingers scrambled for purchase on the wet ledge, his boots kicking uselessly at the brickwork. He managed to hook one arm over the gutter, but the jarring impact forced his other hand to slip. Haerin slid from his grasp. Haerin, he roared, the sound swallowed by a clap of thunder. She didn't fall. In a blur of movement that defied her terror, she had thrown her weight forward, her small hands catching the iron rung of an old fire escape just inches below the roofline. But the metal was rusted, groaning under the sudden tension. She hung there, suspended over the abyss, her eyes wide and reflecting the cold neon of the city. The searchlight swung toward them, illuminating their position. High above, on the opposite roof, a silhouette appeared, a sniper leveling a rifle. Hyunwoo was trapped, hanging by one arm, unable to reach his weapon or the girl. The light, mister. Haerin screamed, her voice piercing the wind. Look at the mirror. She wasn't looking at the gunman. She was looking at a large, discarded industrial mirror leaning against a ventilation duct near her feet. With a strength born of pure desperation, she kicked out, her sneaker shattering the glass just as the sniper fired. The jagged shards didn't just break, they caught the blinding intensity of the helicopter's searchlight and reflected it directly into the sniper's scope. The shot went wide, ricocheting off the brickwork inches from Hyunwoo's head. The sniper recoiled, blinded by the sudden flare of white light. Using that fraction of a second, Hyunwoo hauled himself upward with a guttural cry of exertion. He reached down, catching Haerin by the back of her jacket and swinging her up onto the fire escape platform. They didn't wait for a second shot. They disappeared into the dark interior of the building, the sound of boots on metal echoing like a frantic heartbeat. Inside the shadows of the stairwell, Hyunwoo pulled her into a brief, crushing embrace. He realized then that he hadn't just saved her, she had saved him. The girl who had walked into his office with nothing but a crayon drawing was no longer just a witness. She was his partner. That was quick thinking, he panted, his forehead resting against hers. Papa said mirrors always tell the truth, she whispered, her hands still shaking. And the truth hurts the bad men. Hyunwoo looked toward the door. The hunt was far from over, but for the first time, he felt the momentum shift. He wasn't just running anymore. He was ready to strike back. Hyunwoo sat in the dim light of a basement server room, the hum of cooling fans providing a low, industrial soundtrack to the storm still raging outside. Across from him, Haerin was fast asleep on a pile of server jackets, her small hand still resting on the backpack that held the bad man drawing. He looked at his own reflection in a dark monitor, a man whose face was synonymous with fear, a king who had ruled by the blade for 15 years. He realized then that Minho was right about one thing, he couldn't win this war with a gun. Sangdae and the Council of Seven owned the police, the docks, and the very ground they stood on. If he went out there with bullets, he would die a criminal, and Haerin would be buried as an inconvenient witness. To save her, he had to stop being a monster and start being a ghost. Minho thinks I'm playing a game of turf, Hyunwoo whispered to the empty room, his eyes scanning the amber lattice of the map Haerin had revealed. But the council isn't afraid of death. They're afraid of the light. He began to work, his fingers flying across the keys with a precision that had built his financial empire. He wasn't just looking at the drawing anymore, he was tracing the digital shadows of the coordinates Haerin's father had hidden. The ruby ring in the drawing wasn't just a symbol of a killer, it was a biometric key to a secure server used by the council to move their black bags. He realized that Haerin's father, the architect, hadn't just built buildings, he had built a digital backdoor into the city's corruption. He had known that a man like Sangdae could never resist the urge to flaunt his power, so he had tied the council's financial routing to the very projects they were using to launder their money. Wake up, Haerin, Hyunwoo said softly, kneeling beside her. She blinked, her eyes clearing instantly with the alertness of a child who had forgotten what it felt like to be safe. Is it time to run again? No, Hyunwoo said, a cold, hard smile touching his lips. It's time to speak. Your father didn't just want you to hide this map. He wanted you to show the world what the bad man was doing. He connected a secure line to the national broadcasting headquarters. He knew the lead anchor, a woman who had once tried to expose him and failed. He wouldn't give her a story about a mafia war. He would give her the ledger of a city's soul. He looked at Haerin, realizing the risk he was taking. By exposing the council, he was exposing himself. The records of his own syndicate were intertwined with the corruption. To burn Sangdae, he would have to burn his own throne. Are you sure? Haerin asked, sensing the weight of his silence. If the world sees, you might have to go away. Hyunwoo reached out, his hand steady as he brushed a stray hair from her forehead. I've lived in the shadows so long I forgot what the sun felt like, Haerin. It's time we both stepped out. He hit the upload key. The truth began to bleed across the fiber optic cables of the city, a digital fire that no bullet could stop. The Council of Seven didn't know it yet, but their empire had just become a house of glass. Hyunwoo stood up, picking up his jacket. He was no longer a boss. He was a witness. Let's go, he said. The butcher is going to be very busy tonight. The Grand Seoul Hotel stood like a monument of glass and gold, oblivious to the digital firestorm Hyunwoo had ignited. Inside the Sapphire Ballroom, the Council of Seven were hosting their annual gala, a sea of tuxedos and silk gowns masking the rot beneath. Park Sang-dae stood at the center of it all, the ruby ring on his finger catching the light as he raised a glass to his peers. He looked like a king, but as the heavy oak doors at the back of the hall swung open, the music faltered, and the air in the room curdled. Hyunwoo walked down the center aisle, his stride measured and heavy. He wasn't wearing his usual armor of shadows, he was exposed, his face bruised and his suit stained with the grit of the city. In his left hand, he held Haerin's small, trembling hand. In his right, he carried a tablet. Hyunwoo, Sang-dae barked, his face twisting into the monstrous mask Haerin had captured in crayon. You're a dead man walking into a tomb. Security. But the security didn't move. They were staring at the massive projection screens surrounding the ballroom. The upload had finished. The routing numbers, the recorded payoffs, and the structural blueprints of the Council's illegal empire were scrolling past in a dizzying blur of evidence. The bad man drawing appeared on every screen, superimposed over the faces of the men in the room. The girl is a witness to a murder, Sang-dae, Hyunwoo's voice rang out, cold and resonant, cutting through the panicked murmurs of the elite. And this drawing is the map to your grave. Sang-dae lunged, the desperation of a cornered animal finally breaking his refined facade. He reached for the hidden holster at his waist, but he was too slow. The ballroom doors burst open again, not with syndicate soldiers, but with federal agents led by the very woman Hyunwoo had contacted. In the chaos, Sang-dae found himself staring down the barrel of Hyunwoo's gun. The room went silent, a mirror image of the silence in the office when Haerin had first arrived. Hyunwoo looked at the man who had murdered his father, the man who had hunted a child, and for a second, the old ghost of vengeance screamed for him to pull the trigger. He felt a small tug on his sleeve. He looked down and saw Haerin watching him, her messy hair catching the light of the cameras. She wasn't looking at the bad man with fear anymore, she was looking at Hyunwoo with hope. He's not worth the dark, mister, she whispered. Hyunwoo exhaled, a breath he seemed to have been holding for 15 years. He lowered the weapon and stepped back, letting the agents swarm Sang-dae. As the handcuffs clicked over the ruby ring, the butcher was finally unmasked, not by a rival's bullet, but by a child's truth. Hyunwoo knelt in the middle of the ballroom, oblivious to the flashing cameras and the crumbling empire around him. He pulled Haerin into a protective embrace, shielding her from the glare of the world. The monster had been hunted, the map had been followed, and for the first time in his life, Lee Hyunwoo didn't feel like a boss. He felt like a shield. The stand was over, but the transformation had only just begun. The flashing lights of the police cruisers painted the marble lobby of the Grand Hotel in rhythmic pulses of red and blue. Hyunwoo stood at the center of the storm, his hands empty and visible. He had already handed the encrypted drive containing his own life's work and his own crimes to the federal agents. To dismantle the council, he had to dismantle himself. It was the final price of the map, and he paid it without a flicker of hesitation. He knelt one last time in front of Haerin. The chaos of the arrests swirled around them, but in their small circle, there was only a profound, heavy silence. He took the crumpled, bad man, drawing from his pocket and pressed it into her palm. "I have to go away for a while, Haerin," he whispered, his voice thick with a gravelly warmth. "The law needs to finish what we started. But I want you to keep this. Not to remember the bad man, but to remember that you were the one who stopped him." Haerin's eyes welled with tears, her small fingers gripping the lapels of his ruined suit jacket. "Will you come back? Like the father in your story?" Hyunwoo looked at the handcuffs being prepared by the officers. He looked at the life of shadows he was leaving behind and the dawn that was finally breaking over Seoul. "I promise. No matter how many seconds I have to count, I will find my way back to you." As they led him away, he didn't look back at the cameras or the crumbling elite. He looked at the girl standing with the kind-faced social worker, clutching a drawing and a promise. He walked into the back of the police van, the king of a fallen empire, feeling more like a man than he ever had on a throne. 2 years later. The Han River Park was alive with the sound of laughter and the rustle of cherry blossoms. A young girl with neatly trimmed hair sat on a bench, her nose buried in a sketchbook. She wasn't drawing monsters or maps anymore, she was drawing the river, the bridges, and the sunlight. The shadow of a tall man fell across her page. He was leaner now, his hair shorter, and he wore a simple linen shirt instead of the sharp black suits of his past. The cold, predatory edge in his eyes had been replaced by a quiet, grounded peace. Haerin didn't need to look up to know who it was. She recognized the steady, rhythmic cadence of his step, the walk of a man who no longer had to run. She slid off the bench and walked toward him. She didn't hurry, there was no terror driving her feet today. She simply closed the distance and wrapped her arms around his waist. Hyunwoo closed his eyes, resting his chin on the top of her head as he held her. The empire was gone. The syndicate was a memory buried in legal filings. He had no guards, no marble office, and no crown. But as he looked out over the river, watching the girl he had saved finally living in the light, he knew he had never been more powerful. He wasn't a king of shadows anymore. He was a father. And in the quiet of the afternoon, the promise was finally, beautifully kept.